The video uses AI voice images combined with manual editing. All content is fictional and for entertainment purposes only. Wishing you a relaxing listening experience, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any stories. Mafia boss caught his fat maid stealing leftovers. Then he followed her home and stunned when he saw. Emilio Santini sat in the dimly lit dining room of his Beacon Hill mansion, the silence as heavy and oppressive as the massive mahogany table before him. He was the undisputed head of the Santini syndicate, a man whose name commanded immediate respect and a deep, instinctual fear in equal measure across Boston. Yet, as he stared at the remnants of a lavish 6-course meal prepared by his private Michelin-trained chef, he felt a familiar, hollow detachment creeping into his chest. The room smelled of rich truffles, roasted garlic, and expensive aged wine. But to Emilio, it all tasted like ash. His life was meticulously built on a foundation of absolute power, calculated violence, and unyielding control, leaving little room for anything genuine or warm. He pushed his chair back, the harsh scrape loud and grating against the polished marble floor. It was nearly 2 a.m. Usually, the sprawling mansion would be dead quiet by this hour, the extensive staff long retired to their private quarters or gone home to their families. But tonight, a faint, rhythmic noise from the kitchen broke the absolute stillness. A soft, metallic clatter, followed by the unmistakable, rubbery squeal of the commercial refrigerator door being pulled open. Emilio's large hand instinctively drifted toward the custom 1911 pistol holstered snugly beneath his tailored Italian suit jacket. An armed intrusion into his private residence was highly unlikely given the layers of security, but in his dangerous world, complacency was a guaranteed death sentence. He moved through the shadows with the silent, fluid grace of an apex predator, his polished leather shoes making absolutely no sound as he approached the heavy swinging doors of the kitchen. He nudged one door open just a fraction of an inch. The massive stainless steel commercial kitchen was bathed in the pale, blue-white light spilling from the open walk-in refrigerator. There, standing before the glowing shelves, was not a rival assassin sent to end his reign, but Elsa Weber. Elsa was one of the newer domestic workers, a woman in her late 30s who moved with a slow, deliberate heaviness that spoke of chronic exhaustion. She was plump, her grey uniform always impeccably clean and perfectly pressed, but visibly strained at the seams. Emilio barely knew her name, only recalling from brief passing glances that she was remarkably quiet, always kept her eyes glued to the floor in his presence, and possessed an uncanny, obsessive ability to scrub the intricate mosaic tilework in the grand foyer until it gleamed like newly cut glass. Right now, however, she wasn't cleaning. She was standing at the stainless steel island, hastily wrapping half a loaf of artisanal sourdough, 3 leftover herb-crusted chicken breasts, and a large portion of roasted root vegetables in crinkling aluminum foil. Her movements were jagged and frantic, a stark contrast to her usual slow pace. Her usually placid, unremarkable face was drawn tight with a terrifying mix of raw anxiety and desperate determination. She shoved the awkwardly wrapped parcels into a faded, worn canvas tote bag, her head snapping to look over her shoulder toward the hallway every few seconds like a hunted animal. Stealing, she was stealing from him. Emilio felt a sudden, hot flare of irritation. It wasn't at the loss of the food. He routinely threw away more high-end cuisine than most working-class families ate in a month, but at the sheer audacity of the breach of trust. He demanded absolute, unquestioning loyalty from everyone in his orbit, from his lieutenants down to the groundskeepers. A maid stealing scraps off his plates was a pathetic, almost comical sight, yet it was a direct violation of the strict order and discipline he maintained to keep his empire standing. He pushed the door open fully, stepping into the light. The heavy brass hinges groaned softly in the quiet room. Elsa completely froze. The canvas tote bag slipped from her trembling grasp, hitting the tiled floor with a dull, heavy thud. She whirled around, knocking a silver serving spoon off the counter. Her eyes, wide and completely consumed by terror, locked onto him. He stood there, a towering, dark silhouette against the dim light filtering in from the dining room, looking every bit the ruthless mobster the city whispered about. "Mr. Santini!" she gasped, the air rushing out of her lungs. Her hands shook violently as she clutched the cold edge of the granite counter for support. The remaining color instantly drained from her face, leaving her looking paler than the dusting of pastry flour on the nearby baking station. Emilio stepped further into the kitchen, the harsh fluorescent light from the fridge highlighting the sharp, unforgiving angles of his jaw and cheekbones. He didn't say a single word. He was a master of psychological pressure, letting the heavy silence stretch out, letting her paralyzing fear simmer and boil over. He walked slowly over to the dropped bag, his dark, calculating gaze fixed unblinkingly on her face. He nudged the canvas bag with the toe of his expensive shoe. The sound of crinkling foil filled the agonizingly quiet room. "Are you hungry, Elsa?" he asked. His voice was low, devoid of shouting, but it carried a soft, dangerous rumble that held the promise of a violent storm. No, sir," she stammered, instinctively backing away until her spine hit the edge of the deep industrial sink. I was just—" She swallowed hard, unable to finish the lie. The undeniable evidence of her crime was literally resting at his feet. He fully expected her to break down and cry, to fall to her knees and beg for her job, perhaps even offer up some fabricated, tear-jerking sob story about a sick mother or crushing gambling debt. That was the usual pathetic script when people were caught crossing him. But Elsa didn't weep. Her initial, overwhelming terror seemed to compress and harden into a brittle, unexpected resolve. She forced herself to straighten her slumped shoulders, lifting her chin a fraction of an inch, though she couldn't completely stop the slight, betraying tremor in her rough hands. "I apologize, Mr. Santini," she said, her voice finding a steadier, though still fragile, footing. "It was wrong of me to take what wasn't mine. The food was going to be thrown out in the morning, and I made a poor decision and took it. I will pack my things and leave the premises immediately." Her stoicism genuinely surprised him, sending a ripple of intrigue through his irritation. She was accepting her grim fate without a fight, refusing to cower, and taking full responsibility for her actions. It was an exceptionally rare trait in his treacherous world, where grown men routinely pointed fingers, lied through their teeth, or sobbed for mercy when backed into a corner. Emilio looked down at the bulging bag again, then back up at her face. The primal fear was still swirling in her eyes, but it was carefully masked by a forced, quiet dignity. He could fire her on the spot. He probably should, just to maintain the principle of the matter. But something inexplicable stayed his hand. Curiosity, perhaps. Or maybe it was the specific way she had looked at the bag when she dropped it, not with the gluttonous greed of a thief, but with a hollow, desperate kind of longing that seemed to have absolutely nothing to do with her own appetite. "Leave the bag," Emilio ordered softly, the deadly edge dialing back just a fraction. "Go home, Elsa, and don't ever let me catch you doing something like this in my house again." He turned on his heel and walked back out into the cavernous dining room, leaving her standing frozen in the cold, pale light of the kitchen refrigerator. He knew with absolute certainty she would expect to receive her formal termination papers from the head housekeeper tomorrow morning, but his sharp mind was already formulating a different plan. He needed to know exactly why a woman who was clearly terrified of him would risk her livelihood, and potentially her life, for a few miserable pieces of cold chicken and stale bread. He needed to uncover the secret she was so desperately hiding in that worn canvas bag. And Emilio Santini was a man who always uncovered secrets. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his encrypted phone, and dialed his personal driver. It was time for a late-night drive into the shadows of the city. The faint, powerful hum of the luxury armored sedan's V8 engine was the only sound in the cabin as Emilio followed a discreet distance behind the beat-up, rusted Ford Taurus navigating the sleeping streets of Boston. The transition from the pristine, meticulously swept, gas-lit avenues of Beacon Hill to the grittier, worn-down, forgotten neighborhoods on the industrial outskirts of the city was stark and depressing. The warm glow of expensive streetlights became sparse, replaced by flickering, buzzing halogen bulbs that cast long, unsettling shadows over cracked concrete sidewalks, overflowing dumpsters, and rusted chain-link fences. Emilio sat perfectly still in the spacious back seat, his dark eyes fixed intently on the fading red taillights ahead. He had waited exactly 20 minutes after their tense encounter in the kitchen before slipping out the side door, leaving the sprawling mansion and his sleeping empire in the capable hands of his heavily armed night crew. His driver, a scarred, silent giant of a man named Marco, knew far better than to ask his boss why they were tailing a maid at 3 a.m. "She's turning deep into Southie, boss," Marco murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that barely breached the quiet of the car. Emilio nodded once, his expression unreadable in the rearview mirror. South Boston. It certainly wasn't the absolute worst, most violent part of the city, but it was a completely different universe from the opulent, insulated world of high-stakes power he inhabited. The houses here were small and tightly packed together, like crooked teeth, their vinyl siding peeling, their tiny front yards either wildly overgrown with weeds or paved over entirely with cracked asphalt to make room for broken-down cars. The struggling Taurus finally slowed, its brake lights illuminating a narrow, uneven driveway beside a modest, single-story house at the absolute dead end of a poorly lit, narrow street. The house looked exhausted, its roof sagging slightly in the middle under the weight of years of neglect, a single, dim yellow porch light throwing harsh, unwelcoming shadows across the chipped and peeling white paint of the front door. "Stop here," Emilio instructed softly, tapping the glass partition. Marco immediately pulled the heavy sedan smoothly to the curb, maintaining a discreet, shadowed distance away, and silently cut the headlights. Through the heavy tint of the bulletproof window, Emilio watched intently as Elsa heaved herself out of her car. Without the pristine environment of the mansion around her, she looked utterly exhausted. Her shoulders were severely slumped beneath the weight of a cheap, thin winter coat, and her hand still clutched the handles of her canvas tote bag with a white-knuckled death grip. She didn't look anything like a cunning woman who had just pulled off a daring theft from a Mafia boss. She looked like someone carrying the crushing weight of the entire world on her back, barely managing to keep her knees from buckling. She dragged her feet up the 3 concrete steps to the porch and fumbled blindly with her keychain at the front door, the metal clinking loudly and echoing in the dead quiet of the night. Before she could even find the right key to unlock it, the deadbolt clicked from the inside and the door swung open. Emilio leaned closer to the cold glass of the window, his dark brow furrowing in deep concentration. Based on the sparse file his HR front company had run on her when she was hired, he had fully expected her to live completely alone, or perhaps be burdened with an elderly, bedridden parent or an abusive, deadbeat husband. The background check was a single page. Unmarried, no children listed, spotless criminal record, mediocre credit score. A figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted by the sudden wash of warm, yellow light spilling from the narrow hallway inside. It wasn't an adult. It was a boy, no older than 10 or 11 years old. He was alarmingly small for his age, his faded flannel pajamas hanging far too loosely on his slight, bony frame. Even from this shadowed distance, Emilio could easily see that the boy's skin was a sickly, translucent pale, and he was leaning heavily, almost desperately, on a pair of thick metal forearm crutches just to remain upright. "Aunt Elsa!" The boy's voice carried faintly on the chilling night air. It was a high, thin sound, immediately followed by a wet, painful, chest-rattling cough that made Emilio wince involuntarily. Elsa rushed forward with a sudden burst of frantic energy, dropping the tote bag carelessly onto the wooden porch boards and enveloping the fragile boy in a tight, desperate hug. The soul-crushing exhaustion entirely vanished from her posture in an instant, instantly replaced by a fierce, radiant, fiercely protective energy. She murmured something soft and soothing to him, kissing the top of his bald head repeatedly before gently but firmly ushering him back inside, away from the biting cold of the wind. She paused to pick up the dropped bag, the very bag containing the stolen leftovers she had risked her job for, and followed the boy, pulling the door firmly shut behind her and locking the deadbolt with a loud clack. Emilio slowly sat back against the plush leather seat, the heartbreaking image of the sick, fragile boy permanently etched into his calculating mind. Aunt Elsa. She wasn't a mother, but an aunt acting as one. And she was caring for a boy who looked like a strong gust of wind off the harbor could knock him over and shatter his bones. He reached into his tailored jacket, pulled his encrypted phone from his pocket, and dialed a secure number. It was picked up on the very first ring. "Vito," Emilio said, his voice cold, flat, and entirely devoid of the sudden emotional turbulence churning in his chest. "The new domestic, Elsa Weber. I want everything you can find. Not the sanitized, useless background check you gave me when we hired her. I want the absolute truth. Who exactly is she living with? What's the reality of her financial situation? I want bank records, medical histories, everything. Dig deep and break the law to get it if you have to. Have the complete file on my desk by 8 a.m. sharp." He ended the call abruptly, before Vito could even voice an acknowledgement. He simply stared out the window at the dilapidated house, the single lit window glowing like a fragile, desperate beacon in the pitch-black street. He had caught a petty thief in his kitchen, but he had stumbled upon a deeply desperate woman. Emilio Santini, as a rule, didn't do charity. He dealt exclusively in the currency of leverage and favors. But as he sat in the warmth of the car and watched the cold house, he felt a strange, deeply unsettling tightness gripping his chest. It certainly wasn't pity. Pity was an emotion reserved for the weak, and it got men killed. It was something else, entirely. A faint, haunting flicker of recognition. Long before he was a king, he too had once been a small, hungry boy freezing in a cold house, relying entirely on the fierce, terrifying protection of an older sibling who had absolutely nothing left to give but their own blood. "Take us back, Marco," Emilio finally commanded, his voice tight, his eyes never leaving the small house until the car turned the corner. He had a strong, undeniable feeling that the stolen leftovers were only the prologue of Elsa Weber's story, and he fully intended to read every single page. But first, he needed to know exactly what kind of high-stakes game she was inadvertently playing, and who else might be involved. Because in Emilio's violent, paranoid world, desperate people were the most dangerous people of all, and the most exceptionally dangerous ones were those who had something precious to protect. The next morning, the sky over Boston was the color of bruised iron. Emilio sat behind the massive, hand-carved oak desk in his private home office, the pale morning light struggling to filter through the heavy velvet drapes. The air in the room was thick and pungent with the scent of his double espresso and the impending, heavy weight of the day's illicit business operations. But directly before him lay a single, plain manila folder, sitting in stark contrast to the leather-bound ledgers, burner phones and union contracts that usually occupied his immediate attention. Vito, his broad-shouldered and notoriously brutal underboss, stood at strict attention near the door, his face a carefully blank mask. "It's all in there, boss. Every detail, just like you asked. It wasn't pretty to dig up." Emilio opened the folder, the paper crinkling loudly in the quiet room. The first page was a stark, brutal summary of a broken life, completely devoid of the polished, optimistic lies that usually accompanied standard corporate employee files. Elsa Weber, 38. Never married. No criminal record. Not even a parking ticket. He bypassed the financial summaries for a moment and flipped directly to the next section. There was a grainy photo attached. The boy's name was Leo. He was 10 years old, Elsa's biological nephew. According to the police and coroner reports tucked inside, Elsa's younger sister, Leo's mother, had died of a fentanyl overdose in a cheap motel 3 years prior. The father was listed simply as unknown. Emilio traced a calloused finger over a dense, multi-page medical report clipped to the back of the file. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia. The words jumped off the page like a physical threat. Little Leo had been fighting a losing war against his own body for 2 grueling years. The heavily itemized list of treatments was brutal: rounds of aggressive chemotherapy, bone marrow biopsies, experimental trial drugs, and the accompanying medical bills were nothing short of astronomical. They were numbers that could bankrupt a successful businessman, let alone a woman scrubbing floors. Elsa was listed as the boy's sole legal guardian and financial guarantor. The blurry picture suddenly became crystal clear, razor-sharp, and painfully, devastatingly ordinary. The stolen food in his kitchen wasn't an act of foolish defiance or petty greed. It was a desperate, panicked attempt to provide high-quality nourishment for a severely sick child when her meager, minimum-wage cash earnings barely covered the predatory interest rates on her mounting, insurmountable medical debt. "She's drowning out there, boss," Vito offered quietly, stepping slightly closer to the desk. A rare moment of unsolicited commentary from a man who usually only spoke of violence. "The pediatric oncology ward at Mass Gen is actively threatening to suspend his specialized, life-saving treatments if she doesn't make a significant, lump sum payment by the end of this calendar month. They've already sent her to collections." Emilio closed the thick folder, the loud snap echoing sharply in the quiet, tense room. He had painstakingly built his massive criminal empire on the singular philosophy of exploiting human desperation, expertly finding the hidden weak points in strong men and ruthlessly using them to his absolute advantage. He should logically see Elsa Weber only as a potential liability, a security risk, or perhaps a disposable tool. Yet, the vivid, haunting image of her stoic, dignified face in the harsh light of the kitchen, immediately followed by the fierce, desperate embrace on the freezing porch, profoundly troubled his usually cold, calculating mind. "Does she have any idea we know this?" Emilio asked, leaning back in his leather chair and steepling his fingers. "No, sir, not a clue. My guys were strictly discreet. We hacked the hospital database. We didn't ask questions on the street. Keep it exactly that way." "And Vito?" Emilio paused, letting his dark, penetrating eyes fix on his underboss until the larger man shifted uncomfortably. I want you to find out exactly how much she owes the hospital. All of it. Every last cent, including the collections fees and late penalties. Vito nodded slowly, a distinct flicker of utter surprise quickly masked by his usual stoicism. Yes, boss. Right away. Later that same afternoon, the grand mansion was bustling with the quiet, highly efficient, nervous energy of the large staff frantically preparing for an upcoming evening gathering of the syndicate's lieutenants. Emilio stood silently on the expansive second-floor landing, his hands resting on the cool marble balustrade, looking down into the cavernous grand foyer below. Elsa was there, down on her hands and bruised knees, scrubbing the intricate imported marble pattern with a rhythmic, almost punishing physical intensity. She looked significantly worse than she had the night before. Dark, bruised circles hung heavily under her eyes, and her physical movements, usually steady and methodical, were now jerky, frantic, fueled entirely by the nervous adrenaline of impending doom. He knew exactly what she was thinking. She was agonizingly waiting for the proverbial axe to fall, waiting for the heavy footsteps to approach, waiting to be summoned to his office and unceremoniously fired, thrown out into the cold and back into the crushing reality of her debt with absolutely no source of income to keep her nephew alive. He descended the grand sweeping staircase slowly, his heavy footsteps entirely muffled by the thick, plush carpet runner. As he reached the bottom step, he paused, standing just a few feet away from where she was feverishly working. Elsa froze instantly, the soapy scrubbing brush halting mid-stroke against the stone. She didn't dare look up, her head bowed low, her eyes locked onto the swirling, dirty soapy water in the bucket beside her. The air around her seemed to physically vibrate with raw, suffocating tension. She was holding her breath, waiting for the sentence. "The floors look exceptional today, Elsa," Emilio said. His voice was incredibly calm, perfectly smooth, betraying absolutely nothing of the files he had read or the empathy stirring within him. She slowly, hesitantly lifted her head, her eyes wide and bloodshot, desperately searching his unreadable face for the cruel mockery, the explosive anger, or the dismissal she fully expected. When she found none, she swallowed hard. "Thank you, Mr. Santini. I try my best. My head chef tells me we still have a rather massive abundance of food left over from last night's dinner. Far more than the on-duty staff can possibly consume before it spoils," he continued smoothly, keeping his posture relaxed, but watching her reactions with laser focus. "It is a terrible shame to waste good provisions. When you finish your shift this evening, go see him in the kitchen. He will pack up the excess into proper containers for you. You may take it home." The breath left Elsa's lungs in a sudden, audible rush. Her rigid shoulders violently slumped forward as the immediate, terrifying threat of dismissal abruptly evaporated into the heavy air. Utter, bewildering confusion quickly replaced the stark fear in her tired eyes. "Sir, I don't understand." "I despise unnecessary waste, Elsa. That is all there is to understand," he said firmly, leaving no room for argument or further questions. He didn't wait for her to formulate a reply, turning his back and walking with measured steps towards his private study. He knew exactly what he had just done, and the psychological implications of it. He hadn't just given a thief permission to take high-end leftovers. He had deliberately handed her a lifeline, a silent, powerful acknowledgement that he clearly saw her desperate struggle, even if he flatly refused to name it aloud. But as he closed the heavy oak door of his study behind him, he knew he was setting a highly dangerous precedent for a man in his position. He was a feared leader who demanded absolute, unquestioning obedience and ruthless efficiency from everyone. Showing unprovoked leniency to a lowly maid, even one burdened with a dying nephew, was a microscopic crack in the impenetrable armor he had spent a violent lifetime forging. He rationally told himself it was merely a strategic, calculated move, ensuring a reliable, compliant worker remained focused on cleaning rather than stealing. However, a persistent, nagging thought gnawed at his mind as he sat heavily back down at his desk. He hadn't just given her food to survive. By letting her off the hook, he had willingly surrendered a very small, very real piece of his total control over his environment. And he wasn't entirely sure why he felt compelled to do so. But he knew one thing for certain. Elsa Weber was hiding something far more substantial than a sick nephew and crushing hospital debt. The way she had bravely braced herself for termination without begging, the defiant, unbroken set of her jaw in the kitchen, she possessed an internal resilience and a quiet, steely core that completely contradicted her humble domestic position. He needed to find out exactly what else this woman was capable of before her desperation turned into an unpredictable variable he couldn't control. Days bled seamlessly into a week. The new, unspoken routine between Emilio and Elsa shifted into a silent, intensely observant dance. She continued her grueling cleaning duties with even more meticulous, obsessive care than before. The agonizing, daily wait for termination completely replaced by a cautious, highly suspicious, and fearful gratitude. Every evening, precisely at the end of her shift, she left through the back service door with a heavy canvas tote bag filled not with scraps, but with high-quality, chef-prepared meals, officially sanctioned by the boss himself under the guise of preventing waste. Emilio found himself frequently watching her from the deep shadows of his sprawling home. He keenly noticed the subtle, microscopic changes, the slight, fractional easing of the defensive tension in her shoulders, the way she now moved with a bit more focused purpose, less like a condemned woman walking the final mile to the gallows. Unbeknownst to her, he had also ordered Vito to quietly, efficiently, completely cover the immediate, past-due hospital bills that were threatening Leo's care. It was a substantial, eye-watering sum, funneled securely through a labyrinth of anonymous, offshore charitable trusts he controlled. He justified the immense expense to himself as an investment in security. A distracted, panicked maid with access to his home was a careless, dangerous maid. But his interest had rapidly evolved from morbid, passing curiosity to something much sharper, something akin to professional evaluation. He wanted to understand the internal mechanics of her survival, to see what made her tick under pressure. One incredibly rainy, dismal Tuesday afternoon, Emilio found himself seeking refuge in the mansion's expansive two-story library, a massive, echoing room rarely used by anyone other than himself for quiet reflection. He was slowly nursing a glass of expensive, 20-year-old scotch, staring blankly out the tall windows at the grey, relentless Boston downpour, when he heard a soft, rhythmic rustling sound from the stacks behind him. He turned his head slightly to see Elsa meticulously, carefully dusting the towering, hand-carved mahogany bookshelves. She hadn't noticed him sitting silently in the deep leather wingback chair, tucked away in the shadowy corner. He remained perfectly still and watched her work. She was thorough, as always, but he noticed her attention kept drifting away from the dust and onto the books themselves. She would pause her cleaning, gently running a bare finger over a gold-embossed, leather-bound spine, her lips moving silently as she read the complex titles. He watched in fascination as she slowly slid a thick, heavy volume from the middle shelf, a highly complex, incredibly dense academic treatise on international corporate tax law and offshore sheltering, a book Emilio himself used for reference. She didn't just look at the cover. She opened it reverently, her eyes rapidly scanning the dense, jargon-filled text with a speed and clear comprehension that genuinely startled him. "You find international tax law interesting, Elsa?" Emilio's voice, though quiet and conversational, cut through the heavy silence of the library like a gunshot. Elsa visibly jumped, letting out a small gasp and dropping the feather duster to the floor. She fumbled wildly with the heavy book, nearly dropping it too, before hastily, guiltily shoving it back onto the shelf out of order. I apologize, Mr. Santini," she stammered, her face instantly flushing a deep, embarrassed crimson. She quickly bent to retrieve the duster. "I was just dusting the higher shelves. I didn't mean to pry into your things." Emilio stood up smoothly, leaving his scotch on the side table, and walked slowly, deliberately towards her. "You weren't just dusting just now. You were reading it, and you were understanding the legal precedents by the speed your eyes were moving." She looked down at her work-roughened hands, nervously twisting the thick fabric of her grey apron into knots. I used to read a lot, sir, in my old life." "Your old life?" He stopped just a few feet away from her, deliberately invading her personal space, just enough to assert his dominant presence, but not enough to trigger sheer panic. "The background file I have says you've been doing domestic cleaning work for over 5 years. "Yes, sir, that's true. Since my sister got sick," she replied, keeping her eyes firmly averted, staring at the toes of his expensive shoes. "But before that, I was a certified public accountant. I handled complex payroll, regulatory compliance, and internal auditing for a mid-sized regional logistics firm." Emilio expertly hid his profound surprise behind a mask of indifference. A CPA, a woman highly capable of navigating complex financial structures and corporate audits, was spending her days on her knees, scrubbing his foyer floors. The sheer waste of intellectual talent was deeply offensive to his pragmatic sensibilities, but more importantly, it suddenly presented him with a highly unique, unexpected opportunity. "Why are you cleaning floors, Elsa?" he asked, his tone dropping the polite facade, demanding the raw truth. She finally looked up, her brown eyes flashing with a sudden, surprising spark of deep-seated defiance that cut through her usual subservience. "Because it pays under the table in cash, Mr. Santini. Because it offers me the flexible hours I desperately need, so I can drop everything and take Leo to his emergency treatments, or hold him when he's vomiting from the chemo. Because when my sister died, her massive debts legally became mine, and a rigid, 90-hour-a-week corporate accounting job wouldn't let me vanish for days when my nephew needed me to hold his hand." Her honesty was raw, bleeding, and entirely stripped of the usual, careful deference she showed him. She wasn't just a tragic victim of terrible circumstance. She was a fiercely intelligent woman who had made a calculated, brutal, self-sacrificing choice for the sole sake of her family's survival. Emilio stared at her, radically reassessing the woman standing before him. The plump, quiet, invisible Maid completely vanished from his mind, instantly replaced by a sharp, highly capable, cornered survivor. He made a rapid decision, right then and there, one that went against every single paranoid survival instinct he had honed over decades in the unforgiving criminal underworld. "Come to my private office tomorrow morning at exactly 9 o'clock, he ordered, his tone brokering no refusal. "And wear something other than that uniform." Elsa blinked rapidly, the momentary defiance instantly replaced by deep, panicked confusion. "Sir? Am I being let go?" "No," Emilio said softly, turning away to walk back to his scotch. "You're being promoted." He left her standing frozen in the middle of the library, her brilliant mind reeling with shock. He knew perfectly well he was taking a massive, potentially fatal risk, bringing an unvetted outsider, especially one so financially desperate and emotionally vulnerable. This close to the inner, highly illegal workings of his empire was objectively dangerous. But Emilio Santini didn't get to the top of the Boston underworld by playing it safe. He saw immense, untapped potential in Elsa, a razor-sharp, analytical mind, hidden entirely beneath a humble, unremarkable exterior, fueled by a fierce, unbreakable loyalty to her nephew. He desperately needed someone exactly like that, someone outside the usual circles of greed and ambition. And if she proved untrustworthy or tried to steal real money, well, he knew exactly what she valued most in the entire world. He held her ultimate leverage. The rules of their game had just fundamentally changed, and he was intensely eager to see exactly how she would play her new hand. Elsa stood nervously before the heavy, imposing oak doors of Emilio Santini's private office suite at precisely 8:55 a.m. the next morning. She wore the only professional outfit she still owned, a slightly dated, charcoal grey pantsuit from her old life that now hung far too loosely on her frame, a stark, uncomfortable contrast to the tight-fitted maid's uniform she usually wore. Her hands, still dry and rough from harsh cleaning chemicals, clutched a small, worn spiral notepad and a cheap pen. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She was utterly terrified of what awaited her, but buried deep beneath the thick layers of fear, a small, long-dormant spark of her old, professional self flickered to life. She took a deep breath, steeling herself, and knocked twice, firmly. "Enter!" Emilio's deep, commanding voice carried effortlessly through the thick wood. She pushed the heavy door open and stepped inside. The office was vast and intimidating, lined floor to ceiling with dark wood paneling and leather-bound books, reeking heavily of expensive imported cigars, aged leather, and unspoken power. Emilio sat rigidly behind his massive desk, not bothering to look up from a stack of legal documents he was signing. Vito, the massive, imposing underboss with eyes like dead coal, stood silently near the tall windows, his heavy gaze fixing onto her instantly, assessing her like a hawk watching a field mouse wander into the open. "Sit," Emilio commanded, finally laying his gold pen down and raising his dark eyes to meet hers. Elsa walked forward on legs that felt like lead and took the stiff leather guest chair opposite him, keeping her posture rigid, her knees pressed tightly together. Emilio reached out and slid a remarkably thick, black leather-bound ledger across the polished mahogany desk toward her. It stopped inches from her hands. "Open it." She hesitated for a fraction of a second, her professional instincts screaming a warning, then slowly pulled the heavy book closer and flipped it open. It was entirely filled with rows of meticulous handwritten figures, complex alphanumeric codes, and staggering, unbelievable sums of money. A single glance told her it wasn't standard, legal accounting. It was a deliberate, chaotic labyrinth designed specifically to aggressively obscure the true origin, movement, and final destination of millions of dollars in illicit funds. "This," Emilio said, leaning back in his chair and steepling his fingers, his eyes never leaving her face, "is an absolute, unacceptable mess. My previous associate tasked with handling these particular sensitive accounts was recently let go due to a severe, terminal lack of competence." Vito snorted softly near the window, a wet, ugly sound that violently chilled Elsa to the bone. Even as an outsider, she knew exactly what "let go" meant in Santini's violent world. It didn't mean a severance package. "I need someone brilliant to untangle it," Emilio continued, leaning forward slightly, his presence filling the space between them. "To find the hidden inefficiencies, to plug the leaks, to make the money clean and untraceable. You claim you were an excellent accountant. Elsa stared down at the ledger, the numbers blurring slightly. This wasn't tracking payroll hours for truck drivers at a logistics company. This was the dark, beating financial heartbeat of a major criminal syndicate. If she touched this book, if she analyzed these numbers, she was knowingly crossing a massive legal and moral line she could never, ever uncross. She would become an active accessory to a vast criminal enterprise. "Mr. Santini," she began, her voice tight, trying to maintain her professional composure despite her terror. "This is incredibly complex, and just from a cursory glance, I suspect it is highly irregular and likely illegal." "It is," he agreed readily, offering absolutely no denials or pleasant fictions. "It requires a sharp, analytical mind and absolute, unwavering discretion. The starting pay is exactly triple your current annual salary, paid entirely in untraceable cash, plus, and more importantly, immediate, full, premium medical coverage for both you and your nephew, granting access to any specialist in the country." He had aimed his weapon perfectly, striking the exact center of the target. Full medical coverage. The words hit her physical body like a heavy blow. It meant an immediate, permanent end to the agonizing, begging phone calls to billing departments, the constant, terrifying threats of stopped treatments, the crushing, suffocating weight of debt that kept her awake every night. It meant little Leo might actually have a real, fighting chance to live a full life without her constantly begging the universe for just a little more time. She looked up from the book, meeting Emilio's dark, unreadable eyes. He wasn't simply offering her a job, he was coldly offering her a Faustian deal with the devil. He knew exactly what her single, glaring weakness was, and he was exploiting it brilliantly, without a shred of hesitation. "Why me?" she asked, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. "You have endless resources. You could hire anyone, someone with actual experience in this kind of specific shadow accounting. Because I know exactly what truly motivates you, Elsa," he said softly, leaning closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous purr. "A smart man motivated entirely by greed will inevitably betray you the moment a rival offers a larger sum. But a woman motivated by pure love, a woman fighting tooth and nail for the very life of a sick child, she will fight infinitely harder, and she will remain absolutely, unconditionally loyal, so long as I ensure that child is protected." It was a brutally honest, entirely sociopathic assessment of her extreme vulnerability. He was manipulating her, utilizing her deepest love, and he wasn't even attempting to hide the strings he was pulling. Elsa looked down at the damning ledger again. The massive numbers swam before her eyes, morphing into images of Leo, pale, exhausted, trusting her implicitly to keep him safe from the monsters under the bed. She suddenly thought of the massive, anonymous donation that had miraculously cleared their immediate hospital debt just days ago. A miracle, she now realized with sickening clarity, had come directly from the dangerous man sitting across from her. He had already bought her. This was just the formal signing of the contract. She reached out with a steady hand and pulled the heavy ledger firmly to the center of the desk in front of her. She opened her cheap notepad and loudly clicked her pen. "I'll need immediate, unrestricted access to the past 3 years of your complete transaction records, both digital and physical," she said. Her voice was surprisingly steady and authoritative. The terrified Maid was gone, the hyper-focused accountant completely taking over. "And I work entirely alone. No one, not even him," she jerked her head slightly toward Vito, "looks over my shoulder until I have compiled a comprehensive preliminary report." Emilio smiled, a slow, incredibly dangerous curving of his lips that didn't reach his eyes. It was the very first time she had ever seen him smile, and it terrified her profoundly, more than his deepest scowl. "Agreed," he said softly. As she began to meticulously study the first page of chaotic figures, she felt Vito's heavy, murderous gaze burning holes into the back of her neck. She had just willingly stepped straight into the lion's den, and she had voluntarily, knowingly locked the heavy iron door behind her. The bloody money would undoubtedly save Leo's life. But she knew with cold, absolute certainty that if she failed to perform, or if she ever betrayed the terrifying man sitting across from her, the final cost wouldn't just be the loss of her new job. It would be her life. 3 grueling months passed in a blur of numbers and late nights. Elsa's transformation within the ranks of the Santini organization was swift, silent, and entirely unprecedented. She was no longer the invisible, exhausted maid scrubbing the foyer. She had become the indispensable ghost in the machine. Given a small, highly secure, windowless office deep in the fortified basement of the mansion, she worked relentless, grueling hours, meticulously untangling the chaotic, bleeding web of the syndicate's massive finances. She was nothing short of brilliant. The complex, highly inefficient money laundering schemes that had utterly baffled Emilio's previous street-level associates were systematically dismantled, analyzed, and seamlessly rebuilt by Elsa with ruthless corporate efficiency. She uncovered millions in lost or skimmed revenue, permanently plugged massive financial leaks, and successfully created a new, multi-tiered corporate structure so completely opaque to federal outsiders, yet so crystal clear to Emilio that his grip on the city solidified exponentially. Yet, despite her immense value, she remained a total outsider by choice. She spoke only when spoken to, kept her eyes firmly cast down in the intimidating presence of the heavily armed soldiers, and left the mansion immediately after her long shifts to rush to the hospital to be with Leo. True to his word, the premium medical coverage Emilio promised had been instantly activated. Leo was now receiving the absolute best experimental, targeted treatments available on the East Coast, and a healthy, vibrant color was finally, miraculously returning to his formerly pale cheeks. Emilio, however, found himself increasingly, inexplicably drawn to the quiet basement office. He rationally told himself he was simply going down there to monitor her progress, to ensure she wasn't skimming off the top of the millions she moved daily. But as he repeatedly stood in the doorway, quietly watching her hunched intensely over the glowing dual monitors, her brow furrowed in deep, intellectual concentration, he slowly realized he sought out her quiet presence for a vastly different reason. She was a rare, solid anchor of quiet competence and sanity in a chaotic world built entirely on unpredictable violence, greed, and constant paranoia. One late, stormy evening, Emilio keyed his way into her secure office without knocking. Elsa was aggressively massaging her aching temples, completely surrounded by towering stacks of printed financial ledgers. "You look completely exhausted," he stated flatly, leaning his large frame casually against the doorframe, his suit jacket discarded, his tie loosened. She jumped slightly in her chair, startled, then offered a tired, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "It's just a highly complex discrepancy in the new Cayman offshore accounts, Mr. Santini. It's taking slightly longer to reconcile than I initially anticipated." He walked slowly over, standing closely behind her chair, looking down at the scrolling screens of data. He understood very little of the dense spreadsheets, but he understood perfectly the massive influx of clean capital she consistently produced. "Leave it for tonight," he commanded softly, resting a hand lightly on the back of her chair. "You've done more than enough. The money isn't going anywhere. I just need to trace this last routing number back to—" "Elsa," he interrupted gently, his voice unexpectedly dropping an octave, carrying a rare, genuine warmth she wasn't entirely used to hearing from him. Go home to Leo. He needs his aunt more than I need these numbers tonight. They will still be here tomorrow morning. She looked up at him over her shoulder, genuinely startled by the unexpected softness in his dark eyes. For a fleeting, breathless moment, the massive, invisible wall of status and fear between the ruthless Mafia boss and the former Maid seemed to thin to nothing. She felt a flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with fear. She nodded slowly, saving her complex spreadsheets and powering down the glowing machine. As she quietly gathered her coat and purse, a sharp, violent knock completely shattered the quiet intimacy of the room. Vito pushed the heavy door open aggressively, his face flushed a dark, angry red, his chest heaving. His cold eyes darted suspiciously between Emilio standing close to Elsa. "Boss," Vito said, his voice tight and vibrating with barely contained adrenaline. "We have a massive problem. A big one." Emilio's relaxed demeanor instantly vanished, shifting back to pure, terrifying ice. He stepped away from Elsa, his spine straightening. "What is it?" "It's the Moretti family," Vito spat, casting a dark, venomous, highly suspicious glance at Elsa. "They've finally made a major move. They hit 3 of our main distribution hubs on the southern docks simultaneously in the last hour. It's a massive, highly coordinated attack. They hit us hard. The Morettis were a bitter, violent rival faction, long kept in check by Santini's overwhelming financial and physical power. An unprovoked, highly organized attack of this unprecedented scale meant they had somehow found a critical weakness in Emilio's armor. "Casualties?" Emilio asked, his jaw clenching tight, his mind immediately shifting to war tactics. 4 of our men dead, several more critically wounded. The shipments were completely hijacked. But boss, they knew exactly when those specific, high-value shipments were arriving. Down to the minute. The timing was entirely too perfect for a random hit. Emilio's dark eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. "A leak?" "Yes," Vito said forcefully, taking a threatening step into the room, his aggressive gaze locking entirely onto Elsa, practically vibrating with hostility. And the highly classified information concerning those specific routing schedules was only finalized and uploaded yesterday. In the new financial projections report, the silence that instantly descended in the small room became thick and suffocating, choking the air from Elsa's lungs. She froze entirely, her hand still resting awkwardly on the strap of her purse. The heavy implication of Vito's words hung aggressively in the air, a highly poisonous, lethal accusation. "Are you suggesting something specific, Vito?" Emilio asked, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet, lethal whisper. "I'm saying," Vito replied loudly, pointing a thick, calloused finger directly at Elsa's pale face, that only a very select few people had access to that specific, secure routing data. "You, me, and her." Elsa felt the blood rapidly drain from her face, her stomach plummeting. She had saved the sick boy she loved, but she had blindly stepped into a treacherous world where absolute trust was a total illusion, and she was the newest, softest, most vulnerable target available to blame. She looked desperately at Emilio, searching his dark, intense eyes for any flicker of belief or protection, but his handsome face was currently an impenetrable, terrifying mask of cold calculation. The deadly trap had been suddenly sprung, and she was caught violently in the middle of it. The air in Emilio's private, soundproofed study was incredibly thick, heavy with the metallic, coppery scent of impending violence and cold sweat. Elsa sat stiffly in a straight-backed wooden chair, positioned deliberately in the very center of the large room, feeling incredibly small and terribly, mortally exposed under the bright overhead lights. Across from her, Emilio sat completely still behind his desk, his face an unreadable, terrifying statue of carved stone. Vito paced aggressively behind her chair like a caged, starving tiger, his heavy, threatening footsteps thudding loudly against the expensive Persian rug. It was well past midnight. The mansion, usually a tomb of quiet, now vibrated with the dangerous, nervous energy of dozens of armed soldiers mobilizing frantically downstairs, preparing to violently respond to the sudden Moretti attacks. "Let's go through it again. From the top," Vito snarled aggressively, stopping directly behind Elsa's chair, his voice booming in her ear. "You personally compiled the shipping routing data. You knew the exact delivery schedules. You sold us out to Moretti for a quick, massive payout to cover your little nephew's future medical bills, didn't you? You thought you were smarter than us." "I didn't," Elsa said, her voice shaking slightly, but her underlying tone remarkably firm. She had repeated the exact same true denial for over a grueling hour. "I strictly process the financial numbers. I don't control the physical shipments. I don't know anyone in the Moretti family. I don't even know how to contact them." "Liar!" Vito spat viciously, violently slamming his heavy hand down on the wooden back of her chair, making her jump out of her skin. "You were desperate for money when we found you. Desperate people do incredibly stupid, reckless things." Elsa ignored the looming threat of Vito and looked straight past him, desperately locking eyes with Emilio. He hadn't spoken a single word since they entered the room. He was simply watching her intensely, studying her micro-expressions, dissecting her fear, analyzing her every breath. "Mr. Santini," she pleaded, her voice trembling slightly under the immense pressure. "You know for a fact I wouldn't do this. You gave Leo his life back when no one else would. I owe you absolutely everything. I have zero reason to betray you." "Loyalty bought with cash is only good until a higher bidder comes along," Vito sneered loudly. She saw an opportunity, and she took it. "Enough!" Emilio's voice suddenly cut through the tense room like a freshly sharpened blade. It wasn't loud, but it carried an absolute, terrifying authority that demanded instant compliance. Vito stopped pacing instantly, freezing in place. Emilio slowly stood up and walked around the massive desk, his movements measured and predatory, approaching Elsa. He crouched down smoothly until he was perfectly eye-level with her. His dark, fathomless eyes were incredibly cold, meticulously searching her terrified face for any microscopic sign of deception. "Vito is entirely right about one thing," Emilio said softly, his warm breath ghosting across her pale face. "You were incredibly desperate when we met. But you are also incredibly smart, Elsa. You are far too smart to ever think you could betray me and somehow survive long enough to spend a single cent of that money." He slowly reached out, his large, rough hand gently gripping her chin, tilting her face up slightly to maintain eye contact. His touch was firm, possessive, but surprisingly not violent. "So," he continued, his gaze piercing through her defenses, "if you didn't leak the highly classified information, who in my inner circle did?" Elsa's brilliant mind raced, rapidly shifting from pure terror to cold, analytical logic. She knew for a fact the digital systems she had personally built and encrypted were incredibly secure. She had locked them down herself with military-grade protocols. The only possible way that specific information got out was if someone with the highest level of internal access had deliberately bypassed her security measures. "The internal server logs," she blurted out suddenly, her mind grasping firmly at the technical details. "The final routing data was uploaded and finalized yesterday afternoon. If I check the master server access logs for the past 48 hours, I can see exactly whose specific credentials were used to view and copy that specific file." Vito instantly stepped forward, his face turning a blotchy red. "She's just trying to buy herself time, boss. It's a trick. She could have easily altered the logs to frame someone else. She doesn't have administrative access to alter the core server logs. Only I possess those master keys, Emilio stated flatly, not breaking intense eye contact with Elsa. He let go of her chin, the ghost of his touch lingering, and stood up to his full, towering height. Show me. 10 incredibly tense minutes later, they were back down in Elsa's secure basement office. Emilio stood closely behind her as her fingers flew rapidly across the mechanical keyboard, bringing up cascading lines of dense, green code and exact access timestamps. Vito hovered nervously near the heavy door, his aggressive posture noticeably tense and defensive. "Right here," Elsa said, pointing a shaking finger to a highlighted line of text on the monitor. The specific file containing the dock shipment schedules was accessed, decrypted, and copied at exactly 11:45 p.m. last night. Emilio leaned closer to the glowing screen. By whose exact credentials? Elsa hesitated, her breath catching in her throat, her eyes widening in pure shock as she read the digital name permanently attached to the access log. She slowly turned her head, looking not up at Emilio, but directly at the large man standing rigidly near the door. "It wasn't me," she whispered, the horrifying realization settling heavily and suffocatingly in the small room. The master credentials used to steal the data belonged to Vito. The heavy silence that followed her statement was utterly deafening. Vito's aggressive face rapidly drained of all color, his imposing posture instantly crumbling into sudden, stark, undeniable panic. He opened his mouth to aggressively speak, to loudly deny it. But Emilio turned slowly to him. The cold, analytical mask was entirely gone, instantly replaced by a terrifying, silent, absolute fury. The real, deadly traitor was in the room, and Elsa had just handed Emilio the definitive weapon needed to destroy him. The ensuing confrontation was stunningly swift and horrifyingly brutal, a stark, visceral reminder of the ultra-violent world Elsa had willingly chosen to inhabit. The absolute moment the irrefutable server logs implicated Vito, the desperate underboss lunged, not forward toward the armed Emilio, but violently across the room toward Elsa, a frantic, doomed attempt to eliminate the only witness and the source of the evidence. But Emilio was impossibly faster. He moved with a terrifying, lethal grace born of decades of survival, aggressively intercepting Vito's charge with a vicious, crushing blow to the jaw that sent the much larger man crashing heavily back into the humming server racks. The small basement office instantly became a chaotic, deafening blur of extreme violence. Elsa screamed, immediately diving to huddle tightly under her heavy metal desk, her hands clamped desperately over her ears, her eyes squeezed shut as the sickening sounds of heavy fists hitting bone, grunts of pain, and shattering expensive electronics echoed violently around her in the confined space. It was entirely over in less than 30 seconds. When Elsa finally dared to peek out from under the desk, terrified of what she would see, Vito was prone on the floor, groaning in absolute agony, his previously intimidating face now a bloody, unrecognizable ruin. Emilio stood perfectly balanced over him, breathing heavily but steadily, his heavy, custom 1911 pistol drawn and aimed precisely at his former friend's heaving chest. "You sold me out to Moretti like a common street rat," Emilio said, his voice entirely devoid of any human emotion, sounding more like an executioner's machine than a man. "Why?" Vito spat a thick glob of blood and broken teeth onto the pristine floor, a defiant, broken sneer twisting his lips. "Because you got soft, Emilio. You lost your edge. You let a fat nobody maid run our books. You started caring more about sick little kids and charities instead of running the business like a man. Moretti saw you were weak. He offered me a real, equal partnership. Emilio didn't argue the point. He didn't yell in anger. He simply coldly raised the heavy pistol slightly, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Wait!" Elsa screamed, scrambling out from under the desk, her legs trembling so violently she could barely stand. She didn't care at all about Vito. The man would have killed her without a second thought. But she couldn't stand by and watch Emilio execute a man in cold blood right in front of her. She couldn't let him fully become the soulless monster the world believed him to be. Not while she was there. Emilio paused, his dark eyes flicking sharply toward her, dangerous and completely unreadable. "Don't do it here," she pleaded, her voice shaking violently, tears blurring her vision. "Don't, please, Emilio. The police will hear. The noise." It was a completely flimsy, illogical excuse in a soundproofed basement, but it was all she had to offer. She wasn't begging for Vito's worthless life. She was desperately begging for Emilio's fractured soul. Emilio stared at her pale, tear-streaked face for a long, agonizing moment, the lethal tension in the room thick enough to choke on. Slowly, agonizingly, with immense physical effort, he lowered the heavy weapon. He pulled a secure radio from his belt and barked a harsh command. Within seconds, two of his most hardened, trusted soldiers burst into the room, roughly hauling the battered, bleeding Vito to his feet. "Take this piece of trash to the waterfront warehouse," Emilio ordered coldly, never taking his eyes off Elsa. "Find out exactly what else he told Moretti, every single detail, then handle it permanently." As the rough men dragged the groaning Vito away down the hall, the suffocating silence rushed aggressively back into the destroyed room, heavier and darker than before. Emilio slowly holstered his weapon, his large hands visibly shaking slightly, not from the fading adrenaline of the fight, but from something much deeper and more painful. Betrayal from within his inner circle, from a brother in arms, was a toxic wound that festered deeply. He slowly turned his full attention back to Elsa. She was still sitting on the floor, leaning heavily against the side of the desk, silent tears finally spilling over her lashes and down her cheeks. The tough, professional exterior had completely shattered, leaving only the deeply terrified woman who had just viscerally witnessed the horrifying reality of his ultimate power. He walked slowly over and knelt beside her on the floor, his massive, imposing frame completely dwarfing hers. He reached out hesitantly, his large hand hovering near her face for a moment, before gently, surprisingly tenderly, wiping a stray tear away with his rough thumb. The absolute tenderness of the intimate gesture was jarring, almost heartbreaking, so immediately after the explosive violence. "I am deeply sorry you had to see that side of my world," he said, his voice a low, rough whisper full of regret. Elsa looked up at him, her heart pounding frantically against her ribs. She saw the profound exhaustion in his dark eyes, the incredibly heavy, lonely burden of the violent crown he wore. He was a ruthless, dangerous man, but he had explicitly protected her. He had believed her word over his oldest friends. "He was going to kill me," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I would never, ever let that happen to you," Emilio replied, the deep conviction in his voice absolute and unbreakable. "You saved my entire empire tonight, Elsa. You proved your profound loyalty in a way Vito never could in 20 years. He offered his large hand. She hesitated for only a fraction of a second, then took it firmly. His grip was incredibly strong and reassuringly warm as he pulled her easily to her feet. "Go home, Elsa," he said softly, deliberately refusing to let go of her hand. "Go home to Leo and lock the doors. I have a violent war to manage tonight." She nodded mutely, instinctively squeezing his hand back tightly before finally pulling away. As she quickly gathered her things and practically ran from the destroyed room, she knew with absolute certainty that everything had fundamentally changed between them. She had proven her immense worth, but she had also exposed a deep, hidden vulnerability in Emilio Santini. She had clearly seen the vulnerable man hiding behind the terrifying monster, and terrifyingly, she realized she was rapidly beginning to care deeply for him. But as the chaotic sounds of shouting men and mobilizing, heavily armed cars echoed loudly from the courtyard above, she knew their tentative, fragile connection might not survive the impending storm. The Moretti family was coming for blood, and the real test of survival had just begun. The resulting war with the Morettis was incredibly brutal, swift, and entirely devoid of mercy, tearing violently through the Boston underworld like a Category 5 hurricane. For 2 agonizing weeks, the entire city held its collective breath as the rival syndicates clashed violently in the shadows. Emilio operated like a vengeful phantom, brilliantly orchestrating the intricate defense and devastating counterattacks with ruthless, military precision, fueled entirely by the incredibly detailed financial intelligence Elsa constantly fed him. Elsa didn't go home. She couldn't risk it. She moved entirely into the heavily fortified, luxury guest quarters of the mansion, Leo brought safely with her, under the heavy guard of Emilio's most lethal men. Her basement office rapidly became the nerve center of the war. She worked around the clock, surviving on black coffee and adrenaline, ruthlessly tracing Moretti's hidden money, perfectly anticipating their physical moves based entirely on sudden financial shifts, and systematically, coldly choking off their vital resources. She wasn't just an accountant anymore. She was Emilio's most devastating, lethal weapon. The physical and mental toll it took on her was immense. She lost weight, her eyes permanently shadowed with deep, purple exhaustion. But every single time she felt entirely ready to collapse onto her keyboard, Emilio would suddenly appear. He'd bring her hot coffee himself, sit silently in the dim corner while she worked, or simply place a heavy, reassuring hand firmly on her tense shoulder. The unspoken, profound bond between them solidified rapidly in the intense crucible of violence. He was her absolute protector. She was his brilliant strategist. The violent climax arrived on a suffocatingly humid, moonless night. Elsa had finally, after hours of grueling work, successfully cracked the complex encryption on a hidden, offshore shell company aggressively hiding the Moretti family's final, desperate emergency cash reserves. With a few keystrokes, she had permanently frozen the massive accounts, entirely crippling their ability to pay their remaining soldiers or buy weapons. "It's done," she rasped, her throat dry, leaning back heavily in her chair, staring blankly at the flashing green confirmation screen. "They're completely broke, Emilio. Every account is locked. They can't fight tomorrow without money." Emilio stood closely behind her, both of his hands resting heavily and warmly on her aching shoulders. "You broke them, Elsa. You won this war." Before she could even turn to respond, a massive, deafening explosion violently rocked the entire foundation of the mansion. The lights flickered wildly and died instantly, plunging the secure basement into pitch darkness. Fine dust rained down heavily from the acoustic ceiling tiles. The blaring, shrieking wail of the emergency perimeter alarms began to scream. "They're here," Emilio said. His voice was incredibly cold and terrifyingly, unnaturally calm. A desperate, suicidal final push because they know they're ruined. He blindly grabbed her hand in the dark, yanking her roughly out of her chair. "We need to move now. They'll sweep the entire house." He led her expertly through the dark, labyrinthine basement corridors, his heavy gun already drawn and ready. The terrifying staccato sounds of heavy automatic gunfire and men shouting violently echoed loudly from the floors above them. The final siege had begun. They quickly reached a heavy, seamlessly integrated, reinforced steel door, a state-of-the-art panic room Emilio had built years ago, but arrogantly never intended to actually use. He quickly punched a complex code into the glowing red keypad. The heavy door hissed loudly as the pneumatic seals broke, swinging open. "Get in," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. Elsa balked, digging her heels into the floor. "What about you? What about Leo?" "Leo is safely locked in the secure vault wing with my 6 best men. They won't ever reach him," Emilio assured her rapidly, practically physically pushing her inside the small room. "I have to lead my men upstairs. I have to finish Moretti tonight, or we'll never be safe." "No!" she cried out, desperately gripping his muscular arm, the sheer, paralyzing fear for his life completely overriding her own survival instincts. "You can't go up there into that. It's a complete suicide mission." He stopped resisting her pull, looking down at her face. Even in the dim, red emergency lighting of the corridor, she could clearly see the raw, unfiltered emotion violently warring in his dark eyes. The ruthless, untouchable Mafia boss was entirely gone. There was only a desperate man looking fiercely at the woman he suddenly realized he couldn't live without. He dropped his gun to the floor, grabbed her face desperately in both of his large hands, and kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It was a desperate, fierce, bruising kiss, tasting heavily of fear, adrenaline, and a profound, undeniable, soul-deep connection. It was a fierce promise to return, and a tragic goodbye, all wrapped into one moment. He pulled back slowly, his forehead resting heavily against hers, both of them breathing in ragged, heavy gasps. "I will come back for you," he whispered fiercely, his eyes blazing. "I swear it on my absolute life." He shoved her completely backward into the room and slammed his hand onto the heavy red button on the wall. The massive steel door slammed shut immediately, the heavy locking mechanisms engaging with a series of definitive, terrifying clunks, instantly sealing her in total, suffocating darkness and absolute, terrifying silence. Elsa collapsed heavily onto the floor against the cold steel of the door, hot tears streaming uncontrollably down her face. She was perfectly safe, but the man who had repeatedly saved her, the man she had undeniably come to love, was walking willingly up the stairs into a complete bloodbath. She sat shivering in the dark, the unnatural silence agonizing, desperately waiting for the gunfire above to stop, praying to whatever god was listening that the man who eventually opened the heavy door would be Emilio Santini, and not his ghost. The absolute dead silence inside the sealed panic room stretched out for what felt like hours, becoming a physical, suffocating weight that pressed agonizingly against Elsa's chest. Every microscopic vibration she felt through the thick floorboards, every deeply muffled thud she imagined hearing from the war zone above, sent sharp, icy spikes of terror straight through her heart. She sat huddled on the small emergency cot, her knees pulled tightly to her chest, desperately whispering desperate, fragmented prayers she hadn't spoken aloud since she was a small child. Then eventually, the silence became absolute and unbroken. The faint, distant, imagined sounds of violence entirely ceased. Elsa held her breath, her eyes painfully wide in the dim red emergency light, staring unblinkingly at the heavy steel door. Time entirely lost its meaning. It could have been 10 minutes or 3 days before the heavy, metallic clunk of the locking mechanism finally echoed sharply in the small, confined space. The heavy door slowly swung outward, revealing the harsh, blinding glare of the corridor lights. Elsa scrambled backward on the cot, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs, entirely preparing herself for the absolute worst. A tall figure stood unsteadily in the doorway, silhouetted against the bright light. He was covered entirely in white plaster dust and soot, his incredibly expensive, tailored suit ruined and stained ominously dark in several places. He leaned heavily, exhaustedly against the doorframe, his chest heaving with shallow, painful breaths. "Emilio," she breathed, the single word coming out as a ragged, tearful sob. She flew across the small room, throwing her arms desperately around his neck. He hissed sharply in pain, but his strong arms immediately wrapped around her tightly, burying his dirty face deeply in her hair. He smelled strongly of acrid gun smoke, metallic copper, and profound exhaustion. But to Elsa, it was the absolute sweetest scent of salvation. "It's over," he murmured, his voice incredibly hoarse and rough. "Moretti is dead. His remaining lieutenants completely surrendered. The city is quietly ours again." He pulled back slightly, looking down intently at her face. His own face was badly bruised, a nasty, jagged cut trailing across his sharp cheekbone. But his dark, intense eyes were completely alight with a fierce, possessive, overwhelming relief. "You're hurt," she said frantically, her hands fluttering anxiously over his chest, terrified of finding a fatal, hidden wound. "I'll live," he assured her, offering a weak but entirely genuine, loving smile. "Thanks entirely to you. Without the money, their men broke and ran. You saved all of us, Elsa." The messy aftermath of the brief war required months of intense consolidation and careful rebuilding. But the fundamental dynamic within the Santini Empire had entirely, permanently shifted. Elsa didn't ever return to the basement office. She remained permanently by Emilio's side, not as a desperate maid, not just as a brilliant accountant, but as his fully recognized equal partner. Together, she systematically reformed the entire syndicate's operations, aggressively moving their massive wealth entirely away from the violent, unpredictable streets and firmly into the complex, completely sanitized, highly profitable world of corporate control, real estate, and legitimate investments. A full year later, the Beacon Hill mansion was quiet, but it was a warm, vibrant, lived-in quiet. The heavy velvet drapes were thrown wide open, letting the bright, cheerful morning sun stream directly into the massive dining room. Emilio sat relaxed at the head of the long table, casually nursing a cup of coffee, quietly watching the domestic scene before him, with a look of profound peace he hadn't known since childhood. Leo, now a vibrant 11 years old and completely, miraculously in remission, was arguing excitedly and loudly with the private chef about the absolute merits of chocolate chip versus blueberry pancakes. Elsa walked gracefully into the room, dressed impeccably in a sleek, powerful tailored dress that commanded absolute respect. She looked breathtakingly radiant, the dark shadows of exhaustion entirely gone from her face. She placed a loving hand on Leo's shoulder, laughing genuinely at his loud argument, before walking slowly over to Emilio. She bent down and kissed him gently on the lips, a slow, lingering touch that spoke volumes of deep, quiet devotion and unbreakable trust. "The complex restructuring of the new waterfront properties is finally complete," she murmured softly, taking the chair directly next to him. "It is entirely 100% legitimate, completely untraceable to the old days." Emilio smiled warmly, covering her smaller hand completely with his own. He had started this entire journey aggressively seeking to maintain absolute control, aiming to coldly exploit a desperate woman to simply maintain his violent power. Instead, he had miraculously found his complete equal, a brilliant woman whose profound strength and fierce love had forced him to fundamentally change, to actively build a lasting empire that didn't require constant, endless bloodshed to survive. "You are absolutely incredible, Elsa Santini," he said softly, proudly using the married name she had officially taken 6 months prior. She smiled back at him, her brown eyes shining brightly with unshed tears of profound happiness. From a terrified, desperate maid caught stealing cold leftovers to the brilliant, respected queen of a newly forged, legitimate empire. Her chaotic journey had been fraught with extreme, terrifying danger. But as she looked at her incredibly healthy, energetic nephew and the powerful, deeply loving man sitting beside her, she knew with absolute certainty that every single terrifying moment had been entirely worth it. They had miraculously found each other in the absolute darkest of places, and together, hand in hand, they had built a beautiful life in the light. Thank you for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed the emotional journey of Emilio and Elsa as much as I enjoyed creating it. Their story proves that true strength comes in many unexpected forms, and that even in the absolute darkest of worlds, profound redemption and true love can be found if you're brave enough to look for it. If you enjoyed this novel, please consider subscribing, liking this video, and leaving a comment below about your favorite part. Your continued support helps me create more original, emotional stories for you. Until next time, stay safe and keep listening.